it's the morning after the night before, and I think everyone is still kind of drawing breath after an absolutely sensational start to this World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. What a start! Normally, one's used to quite cagey affairs in the opening game of a World Championship match, but this was something very different. Let's take a look at some details. So, Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces. And Magnus has played a Sicilian. Now that already gives an idea of the kind of intent that he has in this game. You know, he's quite prepared to take the fight to his opponent, even with the black pieces. Well, this is fantastic. I mean, one interesting question is, I wonder what kind of Sicilian he would have played if Fabiano had played d4 here. My guess is he would have gone for a Sveshnikov variation, which was totally disreputable in the late 70s, but actually is very respectable now. But I think predictably, Fabiano went for bishop b5, and this has really become one of the most popular variations in modern chess against knight c6 over the past 20-25 years, actually. And particularly this variation with bishop takes c6. I think Magnus could have predicted this very well. I think that's evident from what happened in the game. Because this kind of position with a relatively fixed pawn structure suits modern chess players, where because there aren't so many pawn breaks, there are no huge surprises in this position, in a sense. So yeah, this is the most popular line for white, and I think Magnus actually chose his opening extremely well, because he's also comfortable in these kind of positions where manoeuvring really predominates. So we're getting to the first moment in the game where there is a big separation of ways. So Magnus has clamped in the centre. So all very standard so far, and this knight is starting a journey. And here white can basically choose castling kingside or castling queenside. Queen d2 is the most popular move, with the idea of castles queenside, but well, I'm sure this was a very major part of Magnus's preparation. And instead Fabiano went for castles kingside, which is a bit tamer. So yeah, maybe he was first game of the match, and you know, he doesn't want to be too surprised by going into a much sharper line by castling queenside. But well, let's see what happens. b6. So this prepares the journey of the knight to f8. So both sides manoeuvring. So this knight often looks to get into d4 and sometimes f4. And Fabiano is preparing to play f4 himself, opening up the position. So this is pretty standard. Here we go. And this makes a lot of sense positionally, because now white controls the centre with these pawns, well, to some extent anyway. So white has this central pawn majority, which can, much later on in the game, be a trump. And here's a very interesting moment. The most obvious move here, particularly as Magnus has been spinning his knight round already, is to play knight e6 and to sink the knight on the central square d4. This is normally what you go for. But this actually gives white a little bit of time, because black has expended a few moves manoeuvring this knight, gives white time to bring his pieces over into attacking positions quite quickly. So, for example, here, if black were to castle, then it's possible to get in bishop h6. Exchanging off these bishops is very, very beneficial for white to weaken the dark squares. And if black were to play h6, as in the game, to prevent bishop h6, then this feels a bit iffy somehow. Obviously black can't castle at the moment, but white has interesting possibilities, maybe to play e5 to go knight e4, maybe just to retreat the knight and play c3 to embarrass the knight on d4. It's lacking squares. So the obvious move, knight e6, not good, because black's king would still be in the middle. White would have time to gain the initiative. Magnus played bishop e6, which seems at first glance crazy to block in the knight, but my guess is that he had researched this position extremely well. And now watch, h6. This is incredibly ambitious. And playing g5 straight away. Remember, the king is still in the middle, and he's advancing his kingside pawns. Now, if the queens are off the board, well, you know, Magnus has two bishops and, you know, everything's fine. But with the queens on the board, the black's king is still in the middle. This is a very, very risky strategy. But it looked like Magnus knew what he was doing. Now here, Fabiano played knight g4 quite quickly, which looks like the obvious way to play to bring the knight back into play, maybe into here. But perhaps you should have just played a4 in anticipation of possible queenside castles with the idea e5. Anyway, knight g4 played. It's kind of the obvious move. Castles queenside. So game on, ladies and gentlemen. We have kings on opposite sides of the board. Well, this is fantastic. What an amazing start to the match. Now here, Fabiano plays the obvious move. But actually, it was probably a mistake. In fact, white's position is sort of more critical than one would imagine. He should have played e5 here. Again, not an obvious move for an early stage in the game, an early stage in the match, where, you know, do you really want to be giving up a pawn at such an early stage? You know, this somehow you want to play in a more secure way. You don't want to sort of have to risk things right at the start. The idea is this: it simply gives this knight on c3 a square, and then b4 just to open up the position. This is risky for both sides, but with hindsight, something like this was probably the best way for Fabiano to play. After knight f6, which looks very nice, in fact, Magnus's judgment was absolutely spot on. After knight d7, in fact, white's temporary initiative just evaporates. Well, for a start, if this knight is exchanged, then black stands very well. These bishops are beautiful, and black can even get ready to try to open the position with g4. These rooks are kind of blunted here. They have nothing to do while the bishop protects. So knight h5. Which also isn't ideal, it has to be said. I mean, it's a moot point, which is a better move, exchanging on d7 or playing knight h5, but these bishops are just fantastic now. g4. So at this moment, Fabiano obviously appreciated, well, he felt uncomfortable. He only had 24 minutes remaining. Carlsen had 53 minutes remaining, so already quite a nice chunk of time advantage here. And if you've got to make a move like g4 to, you know, prevent this break here, already highly unpleasant to have to open up the king. And Magnus obviously has taken control in the center. You know, he's sitting on the center beautifully with this bishop. If knight g7, it would be lovely to hop this knight back into f5, but then simply h5, and you can just start hacking if that's taken, just sacking an exchange, just breaking through to the king. These bishops are so beautiful. So f6 just played, b3, bishop f7. Let's give that knight some grief. if knight g7, once again, this is problematic, to put it mildly, because black wins a piece. Queen g3 check. Thank you very much. So the knight came back. Knight d1. And here's a fascinating moment, and it brought me back to the summer, actually, where I was in Biel commentating, where Shakhriyar Mamedyarov and Magnus Carlsen were fighting it out, some amazing games. But in Biel, Magnus was kind of so eager to always take the initiative. Not always successfully, it has to be said. Particularly reminds me of his game against Peter Svidler, where against Svidler's Najdorf, where he just had to go forward from the word go. And in fact, he didn't need to. He could have maybe played a little more calmly and still had a great position. Here, for example, he could build up, relatively slowly, like this, because actually white can't do much here. Trying to look at taking here and breaking with g4. I mean, white can sort of hold things for the time being, but I think black can steadily improve. You could say that white has found his feet for the moment, but that's a pretty ugly position for the knight on f2. Anyway, that's a legitimate way for black to play. You could also take and switch the knight round to e6, but maybe the queen finds its feet here. Maybe that's not so good. But incredibly, Magnus just went for it straight away. He's just so eager to take the initiative. So knight f8, knight takes f6, knight e6. So he's just given up a pawn just to speed up the knight maneuver to get in to this fantastic square f4. And remarkably, these rooks just can't do much on the f-file because the bishops cover all these squares. The knight came back to h5. Magnus exchanged. And he plonked the knight on f4, so this is clearly his idea. So this knight reaches this dream square, and actually this was the kind of fundamental decision for Caruana at this moment. He couldn't live with the knight, he had to exchange this off. But here, well, Caruana had 6 minutes, Carlsen 33 minutes remaining. Already time pressure, actually. Big decision. Caruana could have sacrificed the exchange here. Now, this is incredibly risky because his king is still exposed, and even the endgame is probably favourable for black, but black can also just play for the attack here. So it's a tough decision. In some ways, this would solve a lot of white's problems, particularly if this knight can find a good square. But I can understand why Fabiano thought, that could go wrong very, very quickly. Instead, he played rook g2. But now Magnus just has the most fantastic initiative. And he played this part of the game extremely well. And pretty quickly too. Queen e6, so obviously threatening to pin and win on the g-file. Rook g8. Now, at first glance, it seems as though Caruana has found his feet with this knight finding a decent square, but actually Magnus had judged this well. He switched the queen back and took on h5. Now, clock time's 2 minutes for Caruana, 24 minutes for Carlsen. Of course, they are playing on an increment. They get 30 seconds added per move. But, well, by this stage, in such a complicated position, and when you're just playing on seconds, that's not a lot of fun. And here, well, because of the potential threat to move the queen, advance the h-pawn, Caruana decided to take a little journey with the king. Oh, this is so risky. Bishop withdrew, good move. So that secures this pawn on f4. Material is even. Queen g5, excellent move, just preparing to push the knight here. And the position is already absolutely critical. Here, well, Carlsen played h5. He could have already played queen e5 to switch that queen down to b2 to hassle the king. And then rook g3. This also looks incredibly promising. What Magnus did also looks really good. He went for another method, putting the queen down here. The knight came around to block. And now that queen could have switched back to g7. This also looks very inviting, just to come back on this route again. But Magnus played h4. Which, well, anyway, I'll explain what happened in a second. But here, the machine alert. Computers like e5 in this position. Well, when you're playing literally with seconds on the clock, this kind of destabilizing move is not the move you consider at all, because you could just lose this pawn for nothing and you're just lost. So when you have seconds, you can never calculate this move. The machine likes this though, but it's such an inhuman move. This is still better for black, by the way. But the machine thinks that, for example, in this position, after this pawn is collected, that white has decent drawing chances in the endgame. It's also possible after e5 just to play king b7 and just say to white, okay, you just make a move. Looks pretty random now. You got seconds. You going to hold your position together? Not so easy. Caruana played the human move, shifting his king across. Now, bishop e5 is a good move for Carlsen. He played king b7, also good. c3, an attempt to plug the dart squares. But in fact, I mean, there are several good moves here, but rook g3 is an absolute killer. This has to be taken. The trick is this: if the queen comes back, you don't need to take this pawn. You can play f3. And this has to be taken, and rook g2 wins the queen. So knight takes, pawn takes, and basically white's major pieces are consigned to blockading those pawns, and there is really no defense here. The queen just sweeps through those queenside pawns. The bishop will join in on e5. The king is in trouble. This is completely winning for black. But bishop e5 played instead. By this time, Magnus also running a little bit short. Caruana was playing on the increment, so he had, literally, like 36 seconds, 37 seconds to make each move. He actually went down to 6 seconds at one point, making a move. Crunch moment, move 39, and here Magnus said after the game that he was considering b5, but wasn't quite sure. And the idea is to open things up with b4 potentially, and white is just very short of a move here. But he was concerned about white playing b4, and that's an incredible move. Would Caruana have played this with like nothing on the clock? And the idea is this: after black takes, white plays d4. I mean, this is so random. This must still be good for black. But incredible that Carlsen thought, better not do this, because he was unsure of what was going on in this position. It's interesting. He said in an interview just before the match started, that he feels he has to improve in positions where there's kind of chaos on the board. Well, he seemed to be tentative when it comes to a chaotic position here. Very interesting. That was in an interview literally the day before, on Thursday. Instead, he played queen g7, attacking this pawn, which also looks pretty good. But Caruana manages to find his feet. Still looks pretty bad for white, to be honest. But somehow white survives in this position. This bishop is beautiful, but crucially the knight comes back into play and white can actually force an exchange of queens. Still better for black. But rook e2 is a really important move, putting the rook behind this pawn, and black can't hang around here, otherwise this knight will come to a decent square. So rook g3 and knight g4. At this point, of course, they've reached the time control, and Caruana is brilliant at calculation, actually, and he'd clearly worked out the next sequence of moves. I mean, basically, Carlsen has nothing else. This is the best that he can achieve from this. White's e-pawn is matched by black's h-pawn, and we're going to get an exchange of pieces very quickly. Of course, there are a few subtleties along the way. I did a little commentating stint with Judith Polgar, and Judith, she's so tricky. She was coming up with this little suggestion, rook e4, with the idea that if h2, that's a double question mark move, then knight d6 threatens a mate here, and the rook. In fact, after rook e4, well, I mean, b5 is a sensible move. One can also entertain this possibility as well. I suspect this endgame is a draw, but black has perhaps a few chances. But anyway, b5 is a safe move after rook e4. But anyway, typical Judith. She is so tricky. Tricky and very, very strong player. Even now, when she's retired, you really sense it. a3, b5. So basically, Magnus can't achieve much more in this position and trades down into this rook and pawn endgame, which is certainly a theoretical draw. But Magnus has his little advantage. He's got that little extra pawn. 3 pawns against 2 on the same side is a draw. Now, this is a little bit different because these pawns are split. Even so, there's too little material to force a win here. This is absolutely a draw. And actually, Fabiano defended accurately and quickly, more to the point. Magnus tried to squeeze water from a stone, as he say in English. Normally we say squeeze blood from a stone. It's even more graphic. But yeah, okay, let me show you this position, and I'm going to show you a position, well, quite a few moves later. Let's say here. Well, you can see the structure has hardly changed, only 2 pawn moves. We had a little change about here, where finally a bit of action took place. But actually, this is a completely drawn position because black needs to keep hold of that c-pawn, and while the rook stands here, it's impossible. And of course, trading c for b is just a draw. So the game finished like this. I'll just go for a couple more moves. After 115 moves, basically here the players agreed a draw. After 7 hours play, an extraordinary game, a fantastic start to the match, and well, this one really is living up to expectations. I'll be back again for game 2. Well, I hope you enjoy the match. I think we're in for some really, really long games, but it's quite clear that both players have come here to fight, and they're not afraid of a great fight as well.